Now we are ready to attach the gusset to the zippered block. And if you plan to quilt the gusset so that it's attached to the lining, you'll need to mark your quilting lines on your fabric before you sew the gusset onto the zipper block. So I recommend usually using a blue washout marker, but since I'm using blue fabric, I have used a white chalk marker. And also, if you remember, we cut this piece wider. So what I have done so that I can center my zipper on it correctly is I've stuck pins in exactly where the seam line is. So that way when I put this right sides together, I've got this right sides together, I can align the gusset so that the seam will get stitched in the correct place. So it's centered between these two pins. So go ahead and pin this one side on. And then you can place the lining, so the interfaced gusset that you've got your grid lines drawn on goes right sides together with the zipper panel, and then the lining gusset piece will go on the wrong side of the zipper. And again, you're going to stitch this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. After stitching the gusset panel to the zipper block, you can go ahead and edge stitch close to the seam. So that's the first side. To stitch the second side, you're going to put the right sides together again. And again, you want to make sure you center this over the zipper block because this panel is wider. And then you're going to take the lining piece and flip that over. And match up those cut ends as well. You're going to have the zipper block sandwiched between these two, the lining and the fashion fabric. Okay, so I have both sides attached, and I've used my spray adhesive to stick these two layers together, the gusset lining and the fashion fabric, and now I'm ready to start quilting. If you don't have the spray adhesive, you can just use pins and pin these together so that nothing shifts while you're quilting. But I just go ahead and start on one side, and I have changed my stitch length to a 4. You can use a 4 or a 4.5. I think the quilting stitch looks a little bit better if it's a longer stitch length. And for the ends, I go right up to my edge stitching line, and then I pivot, and I'll go across that line one more time until I get to the next line that I need to stitch on. And then I'm going to lift my foot and pivot again. That way you don't have all kinds of starts and stops and loose threads hanging. Go ahead and quilt this whole gusset piece. All the quilting is finished now. If you haven't quilted, you still have to do this next step. So with the quilting finished, I want to align the edges and fold this in half, because now we need to trim off this extra fabric on each side. So I'm going to align my ruler with the cut edge on the side of the zipper area and extend it down this way, and then with my rotary cutter I'm going to trim off the excess here. And you've got a nice clean cut there. And then I'm going to do the same on the opposite side. Before I actually make the cut, I want to make sure that this is even along both sides, the same width. But while it's still folded in half, and you'll see you've got the seams here from the zipper block matching, I'm going to go ahead and put a pin at the folded edge on this side as well as on this side. And I'm going to do the same thing at the opposite end. So this marks the halfway point. And then I'm going to refold it and match the pins up. And at this folded edge, I'm also going to put a pin on both sides. Now we have marked this circle into quarters, and we need to have it marked in quarters because if you recall, the vinyl piece is marked off in quarters. So if you are not going to put piping on your bag, you would be at a point where you are ready to attach the vinyl to the gusset. I am going to pipe both sides of this, so I'm not going to attach this yet. So the next thing will be to take your piping and attach that to the bag. And I usually like to start somewhere at the bottom so that where you end up with a seam will be at the bottom of the bag. I'm about to the end of where I've made my piping, so I'm ready to join this up and encase the seam. So I've removed the stitching from the piping here so that I can move the cording around and move the fabric. And what you want to do is you want to keep the cut edge even with the cut edge, but you want to turn this at a 45-degree angle. And then you can lay the first where you began your stitching, and at this point you want to cut your cording off at exactly the same point, and then flip this over, and that will encase the remaining cording, and you'll have a nice. Okay, so here we have our encased cording. The next step is to attach the vinyl. So remember, one way is taller. This is a little over 8 inches, and side to side is around 7 inches. So make sure you have the correct one chosen. And you're going to match up that mark on the vinyl with the pin that was in the fabric and clip that. And then you're going to move around to the side, and you're going to match the next pin with the next mark and clip that. Till you get all 4 places secured. And once all 4 of these are secured, then you can move and work your way around the circle that you've created here. So I'm going to put a clip closer here and a clip a little closer here. And then in order to get around the curve, you're going to need to cut into the seam allowance here so that it can curve around that outside edge there. And you want to cut close to the stitching line, but don't go through that stitching line. And then you can see that we can work our way around the vinyl at this point. So I put extra clips on each of the curves. And then you're going to do the same thing, working your way around the entire circle. I have the vinyl all clipped to the gusset piece, and now I'm ready to stitch these together. I have lengthened my stitch length to a 3.5. You don't want too many perforations in the vinyl or it will act like paper dolls that you punch out, so less holes are better. So 3.0, 3.5 works pretty well. And I'm going to stitch with the fabric on the top side because, as you can see, there's just one row of stitching here. And I want to make sure that when I stitch this again, that my needle is one thread closer to the cording than it was for the first row of stitching when I attached the piping. I also like to use the needle down position for this so that if I have to stop and you know, turn a little bit at the corners, that it can be easily done and the fabric won't slip out of place. So the first side is on and it looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to pop it back inside out again. And I'm ready to attach the second piece of vinyl to this other side. And the process is exactly the same as attaching the first one. Here's just a little tip for you. Before you attach the second side of the vinyl on the stadium bag, make sure your zipper is open. If you keep it closed, you will not be able to turn the bag inside out afterwards. And my other tip, I have made several of these, and initially I was stitching following my previous piping line, which always makes sense to me, but the vinyl did tend to stick a little bit to the bed of the sewing machine. So on this bag number 3 that I'm making, I actually sewed with the vinyl facing up, and because it's see-through, you can still see to get a stitching thread closer to the piping. The next step is to cover the seam allowance with bias tape. And you can use purchased either 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch tape. I prefer to make my own, so that's what I've done. When you start out, you want to fold under a little bit of fabric first so that you have a finished end by the time you get around to the other side. So I'm going to lay this one on top of that, clip that on, and then I'm going to sew from this side of the fabric, and I'm going to try to stay right on this stitching line. So I'll need to use a zipper foot to do that. And you're just going to go all the way around the bag with that. I've stitched the bias tape all around the bag. That's a little bit, it's a little tricky, but because the vinyl is covered with fabric on both sides, you don't have any issues with the vinyl sticking. So that was a good thing. The next step, and I also used a 4.0 stitch length. I'm trying to not put any more perforations in the plastic than necessary. So the next step is to take the bias tape and flip it over onto so that it encases your cut edge here. And I'm going to do that all around the bag. And once that's finished, then I will stitch from this side to stitch it down, and that will give you a nice covered seam allowance. When you get to the section where you began and end the tape here, it looks best if you fold the outer tape over the inside tape and turn it down that way. It just gives a smoother finish to that little edge there. And it's worth mentioning, I find that the 1/4 inch bias tape is a little narrow for my liking, but the 1/2 inch bias tape seems to be a little too large, which is why I prefer to make my own. So I use the number 12 Clover tape maker. These are great tools, and that way I can cut my bias strips 1.5 inches wide, and as you pull them through, you end up with a 3/8 inch bias. So I find that to be perfect for this project, and I will put a link to that below in the description. You may need to experiment with different feet to see which one works best for you. I found the open toe foot seemed to be easiest to use for this part of the application. Okay, so I've got the first bias seam all encased, and I think it looks pretty good. So now I will finish the second side of the bag, do the other seam allowance, and then we'll be ready to turn it right side out. So I've got the bag turned right side out. I'm quite happy with the way it looks. Before you turn it right side out, you want to make sure that you have cut any stray threads. You don't want to have to deal with those after you've turned it right side out. To make the strap, you want to feed the strap through, go over and under the center section of the swivel clasp. Then you're going to turn under about 1/4 inch and going to stitch that down. And I like to go back and forth a couple times to make sure it's secure. Once the clasp is secure on one side of the strap, you want to go ahead and feed one of the swivel hooks through the strap. And then you're going to want to come back through this swivel hook. And when you do that, be sure you, before stitching anything down, make sure that it isn't twisted anywhere. And then on this end, we're going to attach the other swivel hook. So you're just going to stick that on. You're going to turn under 1/4 inch, turn it over to the inside, and then stitch this on. And again, I go back and forth a couple times. And there you go. I've got my straps hooked onto my bag, and it is ready to pack and go. So I can stick my water bottle in here, I can stick my sunglasses, lip gloss, you know, whatever you think you might want to take to the stadium. This actually will hold 2 water bottles, but I just want to give you a visual here for one. So there is your stadium bag. It's a nice size. I hope you enjoy making this. If you liked this video and would like to continue getting notified when I create a new video, please hit the subscribe button below.